It was beyond my wildest imagination that I would one day become the notorious RBG. I am now 86 years old, yet people of all ages want to take their picture with me. Amazing.
I'd wait in line to take a picture with her. That, of course, the liberal icon of the Supreme Court, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, at the University of Buffalo this week. It was her first public appearance since word that she was treated for pancreatic cancer this summer. She has also overcome colon cancer, growths in her lungs, and even broken ribs since joining the High Court. Every time Ginsburg's health makes news, it is, of course, a major concern for Democrats and for liberals, including questions about what would happen should there be a vacancy on the court next year as we barrel towards the 2020 election. That, of course, is what happened in 2016 when the passing of Antonin Scalia left an opening during that election year. President Obama, of course, nominated Merrick Garland, who never got a hearing or a vote in the Senate thanks to Mitch McConnell. And of course, McConnell now says he would fill an opening next year, despite the precedent he claimed while rejecting Garland. And setting up the conditions that pave the way for Trump to get two nominees, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, onto the High Court instead. Meanwhile, the president, who made the High Court a major issue during the 2016 race, seems poised to try and do so once again next year. And there's reporting that the Trump team is already looking to do that, make the Supreme Court, and in fact the entire federal bench, a major issue ahead of 2020. For more, we turn to Dahlia Lithwick, who writes about the courts and law for Slate and who hosts the Amicus podcast. She's also written about how Democrats still don't have a plan to deal with McConnell on the courts. Dahlia, what did you mean when you wrote that Democrats haven't learned their lesson when it comes to McConnell and the courts?
Well, I think that Democrats, the saying is they keep bringing a butter knife to a gunfight, and that McConnell has been pretty clear, even before Merrick Garland, for a very long time, that his one and only job would be to obstruct Barack Obama nominees, then to hold the Scalia seat open, and now, in the wake of the Trump presidency, to just mash through as many possible judges as he can get through. Donald Trump has appointed more judges than any president in modern history. And Democrats keep trying to sort of reason with him, meet him halfway, talk about reinstating the filibuster. I think they just keep understanding this as some kind of game where you can meet in the middle, as opposed to understand that this is kind of a smash and grab right now as far as Mitch McConnell's concerned.
So let's focus on the Supreme Court for now. Let's say there's a SCOTUS opening in 2020. McConnell has already said he will fill the spot. Two questions here. First is the process question. If it's a liberal seat that's being replaced, I can only imagine the public will go bananas. How will the Senate respond, and will the public reaction, how will that impact what the Senate does?
Well, I think it's going to be everything that was grotesque about both the Gorsuch hearing for the Scalia seat and then later the Brett Kavanaugh hearing when Anthony Kennedy stepped down, except this time it won't be a Republican appointee being replaced by a Republican president. It would be presumably a Democrat being replaced by a Republican. And I think you're right. People will go even more bananas, recognizing that Anthony Kennedy, when he left and was replaced this year by Brett Kavanaugh, that was already a seismic change at the court. That was the centrist being replaced by a reliable conservative. I think it's fair to say that it will be all that on stilts, maybe without the sexual harassment allegations, but certainly I think the sense that the court will be lost to progressives for generations is absolutely going to animate it. And as a process question, I think you're quite right. Democrats can be enraged and frustrated, and they can campaign and they can raise funds, but they don't have the votes to block it. It will make people like Susan Collins, who says, look, I'm a Republican, but I'm also pro-choice and I don't want to see Roe v. Wade undermined. It will put her on the hook, although it's important to recognize she voted for Brett Kavanaugh. She spearheaded the defense of Brett Kavanaugh, and she's voted for all of Trump's judicial nominees. So I think that Democrats who put their hopes in sort of, quote, moderate Republicans to save them this time around when it comes to Ginsburg seats, I don't think we've seen much evidence that that's going to happen.
And in terms of the impact on the court's decisions, if it's, let's say, Ginsburg's seat and she's replaced by a conservative, is there any way to measure what happens to the court in terms of its rulings?
Again, it will be seismic. We've already seen with Anthony Kennedy, he was the fifth vote to uphold Roe in whole women's health just a few years ago. I think that it's fair to say that losing his seat and having Brett Kavanaugh take it over, I think he will be a reliable anti-Roe vote. So I think in some sense, really the seismic change has already happened. I think what will be lost with Ruth Bader Ginsburg if she goes is the leader of the liberal wing of the court, a person who's assigned opinions, the person who has sort of shaped the focus of the Democratic wing of the court. But I think in some profound way, the damage already happened when Anthony Kennedy left.
If there is an opening, of course, everybody would hope that the nominee would be qualified and would be considered to be within the bounds of reasonable legal debate. But that really hasn't been the case with other Trump nominees to the federal bench, correct?
Yeah, no, I think one thing we can, I think, stipulate fairly is that both Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch at the U.S. Supreme Court were qualified nominees. You have to bracket the questions around Kavanaugh's conduct. But nobody, I think, would dispute that they were serious, thoughtful jurists who were well qualified in terms of having a long and storied history as a thoughtful judge. But I think you're quite right. Some of the nominees that Donald Trump has put up for the lower courts have had no judicial experience. Some of them have literally been elevated bloggers. Some of them have been activists in anti-gay, anti-choice, anti-women's causes with no demonstrable history. Famously, one of them had actually never been in a courtroom and didn't know in his hearing what basic things that you would know if you just watched Law and Order, what a motion in limine is. And some of those folks have gotten through. Very few of them have not gotten through. Last week, Donald Trump put up someone for the federal bench who has written in praise of ethno-national states. So really, we're seeing a lot of people who I think if we were looking at a Mitt Romney presidency or a Ted Cruz presidency would not have gotten into the room, who are actually getting lifetime seats, Article 3 seats. They're very young by and large. Some of them are in their 30s. So these are folks who are going to be on the courts when our grandchildren are in participating in democracy.
Trump, of course, campaigned on the Supreme Court and courts in general in 2016, and there's reports that he's planning on doing it again. For some reason, the Supreme Court as an issue hasn't really seemed to resonate with Democrats, or at least it hasn't helped. If there's an opening, obviously it'll be a big issue on both sides, but how can Democrats elevate the Supreme Court as an issue before there's an opening, and why hasn't the court been as big for Democrats as it has been for Republicans?
That is, I think, Andrew, the salient question of this election. I think that when you look at the 2016 election, Democrats had an empty seat. They had Scalia's seat. It was being held open on a pretext by Merrick Garland, and they didn't show up to vote on it. Democrats didn't run for the Senate on the proposition that Merrick Garland was being blocked. And when you saw the exit polls, by 2-to-1 margins, people who said the court was important to them broke for Donald Trump. So you are quite right. There's a massive differential in enthusiasm around the court. But I think the one thing that is going to change that very likely is that this term, the court has teed up almost every big ticket issue that they deferred last year. And so in the coming term that starts on the first Monday of October, the court has on its docket a monster gun case, the DACA case about Dreamers. It has the trans ban in the military, whether federal anti-discrimination laws protect anti-LGBTQ workers, abortion cases that are in the pipeline. So almost every issue that the court has tried to bat away will be teed up to be heard this term. And that means that next June, going into the election, the court will have decided not just one, not just two, possibly 6, 7, 8 blockbuster issues of our time. And if that can't rally Democrats to be interested and engaged on the idea of the Supreme Court, it's hard to know what will.
Dahlia, there's been talk among some Democrats of trying to pack the court should they win back the White House and win the Senate. Is that an idea that has legs? They certainly could do it if they killed the filibuster, but would they, and what are the challenges and the potential blowback?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think we've seen various plans in the ether. Pete Buttigieg has a plan that he's talking about. Kamala Harris has suggested she might be open to some kind of structural plan to change the courts. In some of these plans, when they're talking about term limiting justices or talking about having, some justices pick other justices, I think you'd be talking about amending the Constitution, and so those really have a very, very high hurdle. There is nothing in the Constitution that demands that there be 9 justices on the court, and we've had periods in history where the Supreme Court has had 5 justices and 6 and 8. We also know that when FDR tried to pack the courts to protect his New Deal agenda, he almost derailed his own presidency. Americans are very, very fond of the notion that we have 9 justices and not more. So I think the things that are blocking it largely are sort of principles and practices that tell American people that we don't mess with the size of the court and we don't try to pack it. At the same time, I think there might be a real feeling that it's time to create more lower federal court judgeships, to create a whole lot more circuit court judgeships, district court judgeships, and try to push back against the reality that Donald Trump has already seated in 2.5 years more than 1/5 of the federal circuit court judges. Again, they tend to be very young. They will be sitting for decades, and they're starting to flip circuits. And so I don't know that court packing at the Supreme Court level is going to have a lot of legs, and I don't know that it's a first order issue for most of the Democrats running for office. I do know that if there was a desire and a focus on really rethinking the district court and circuit court judgeships, that could presumably be done. But again, I think it would require, all of this would require Democrats to start to think very tactically and strategically about the Supreme Court and the lower courts in the way they have not done for decades.
My final question, Dahlia, is the nightmare scenario, one that people are now discussing more and more in public. That's if Trump loses the 2020 election but claims voter fraud or some other problem and refuses to recognize the results or leave office. At that point, a lot of people will be turning towards the court. Any idea what they might do if asked, in any sense whether Trump's appointees would, in that moment, lean on what Trump seems to value most, loyalty to him?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it is the nightmare question. It's the one we all think about. At some level, I think maybe the best evidence we have is that John Roberts broke against the Trump administration this year in the big census case, voted against the administration, voted against Wilbur Ross, and voted with the court's Democrats. I think that there is at least some reason to believe that when the rubber hits the road, John Roberts is first and foremost an institutionalist. He cares deeply about the public esteem of the court, and some reason to believe that if it really came down to the kind of constitutional crisis that you're describing, John Roberts may be the 5th vote to join with the Democrats simply to preserve the rule of law in America.
Dahlia Lithwick writes about the courts and the law for Slate. She also hosts the podcast Amicus. A terrific conversation, Dahlia. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
And up next, we will shift gears. A new film that's a real-life David and Goliath story in more ways than one. But instead of a slingshot, the heroes of this documentary use a baseball and a bat. One of the filmmakers joins us after the break.